I'm Joe Lowndes, co-president of the Chicago Art Deco Society, and welcome to our celebration of World Art Deco Day 2023. We are so pleased that people from all over the world have signed up for today's presentation. The suggested theme for this year's event is Egyptomania. Icads is lucky to have a member, Jeffrey Lyle Siegel, who is an expert on this topic. He has a great deal of material to share with us, so let's jump right in. Here's Jeffrey outside of one of Chicago's most impressive Egyptian-style buildings. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, members of the Icads, for allowing me this opportunity to share some of my passion for the subject of Egyptomania with you all. And I'm standing in front of the Reby Moving and Storage Building, one of Chicago's finest examples of Egyptomania architecture. Egyptomania is an affectionate term for the West's passion for the design, culture, and personalities of ancient Egypt. This masterpiece of Egyptomania was designed by architect George Kingsley and sculptor Fritz Albert. The two figures of Ramsay II flanking the doorway are supposed to represent the Reby brothers, John and William. The hieroglyphics on the building celebrate the fact that the Egyptians were the first great movers and storers. Even though the ornament was accurately modeled after Egyptian temples, there's no attempt to make this appear to be an Egyptian temple. It's clearly a modern Western building, lovingly appointed with Egyptian motifs. To me, the fun of Egyptomania is seeing the two cultures side by side, whether in song, dance, decorative art, or architecture. As collectors of Art Deco interested in events of the 1920s, you might think that the Reby building was inspired by the discovery of the tomb of King Tut in 1922, but it was not. John Reby saw another similar moving and storage building with an Egyptian theme in Stockton, California, that was built in 1918, and traveled himself to Egypt prior to 1921. He commissioned the design in 1921, and it was completed in 1922. So the Reby building just represents John Reby's own personal Egyptomania. My connection to Egyptomania is equally personal. I had been interested in art since my teens and grew up as a theater performer, but I was not interested in antiques at all until my grandmother passed away in 1993. All of a sudden, I was looking differently at things in her home that I had seen all my life. My grandmother was not a collector, but her sister Stella, who I never met, was a world traveler, and she probably purchased several of the things that caught my eye. One of them was this Egyptomania lamp. Although the lamp is unmarked, the shade is very similar to other shades produced by the Handel Company. The conical lampshade comes to a point suggestive of the pyramids. The shade is surmounted all along the perimeter by pharaoh heads set against tiny pyramids, and foliage whose gentle leaves curve in a way that evokes the last years of Art Nouveau. So I would guess it was made between 1915 and 1920. My grandmother couldn't give this lamp away for 40 years. My sister took the lamp home after she died, and it took me 5 years to get it back from her. This started me on a 30-year journey collecting Art Deco of the 1920s and 30s, as well as Art Nouveau and posters of the Belle Epoque. But Egyptomania has always remained a central portion of my collection and my interest. Egyptomania is as old as Cleopatra. You might call her the first Egyptomaniac. She wasn't Egyptian. She was a descendant of one of the generals of Alexander the Great and the last of the Ptolemaic Greek rulers of Egypt, who ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander in 383 BC. She's also the only one who cared enough to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra saw the threat of Roman expansion, so she seduced two Roman generals, first Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, hoping to form an alliance which could resist Augustus Caesar. However, both Cleopatra and Mark Antony killed themselves after their forces were defeated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Despite her reputation as a scholar, a linguist, and a leader, 200 years after her death, Plutarch described Cleopatra as a frivolous and dangerous sensualist. This suited the Roman narrative that Mark Antony would have been unfit to lead them. Shakespeare followed Plutarch closely in his play, Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was depicted, ever after that, as a dark and dangerous femme fatale. To some, Egyptomania means collecting ancient artifacts. After their conquest of Egypt, the Romans took home 15 of the 22 Egyptian obelisks which remain worldwide, including the Vatican obelisk. That kind of collecting is a lot harder to do today. To others, Egyptomania means recreating the objects of the past with historical accuracy. This chair is a reproduction of the throne chair from King Tut's tomb. However, recreating ancient Egypt accurately wasn't possible for a long time because most people in the West had no idea what Egypt really looked like. That is, until Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. At that time, France was still at war with Britain. By invading Egypt, Napoleon hoped to disrupt the British trade routes and establish French dominance in the exotic East. For years, the legend was that Napoleon let his troops shoot off the nose of the Sphinx while using it for target practice. However, this print proves that the rumor was false. Tool marks on the Sphinx indicate that the nose was deliberately broken off in an act of prior vandalism, which has been attributed to a Muslim leader's religious protest. Napoleon brought with him roughly 160 artists and scientists, who collaborated on the first accurate visual record of Egypt called, appropriately, The Description of Egypt. It took the efforts of 2,000 technicians and 400 engravers to complete the series in installments between 1809 and 1829. It was, at the time, the largest known published work in the world. During the 19th century, Western artists took great care to accurately reflect Egyptian sources in their designs. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 led to an increase in both merchant and passenger travel. This also popularized Orientalism in art, which refers to works by Western artists depicting Eastern subjects, including Egypt. The stillness, solemnity, and symmetry of Egyptian sculpture and architecture made the Egyptian theme very popular for funeral monuments from the time of Napoleon through the 19th century. These early Egyptomania bookends in my collection have a somber aspect reminiscent of the use of Egyptian themes in funeral monuments. This porcelain Egyptian figurine from my collection has a similar sense of mystery, being shrouded in clothing. Here is a tableau of some small decorative objects from my collection, which I created around the base of my grandmother's lamp. There are 5 Egyptomania incense burners, 2 Egyptian-inspired porcelains by Rosenthal, and a wonderful hand mirror with Cleopatra in the center. Above is an actual ancient Egyptian cosmetic spoon, known as the swimming girl. Below, the design has been adapted into an incense burner. Cleopatra's asp was no doubt the inspiration for this wonderful lamp by Louis Tiffany and Company. Egyptian-themed jewelry was popular from the late 19th century onwards, well before King Tut was found. This temple clip sold at auction in 2010 for $14,000. These diamond, ruby, and emerald earrings by La Cloche Frere sold at auction in 2022 for $352,800. They must have been purchased by a pharaoh. This figural vase and candlestick are both from my collection. The candlestick is a painted plaster copy of the original. They called these plaster pieces chalkware. Items like this might have been a carnival game prize, so you could collect Egyptomania on a budget. This lamp is a personal favorite from my collection. Of particular interest are the several modern design influences in the lamp. The stylized waterfalls on either side of the stair-stepped shade are a popular motif in Art Deco, and a particularly unusual design element to add to a lamp with a desert motif. The Shelton Hotel in New York City was one of the first to take advantage of a 1916 change to the zoning laws, requiring buildings to be narrower as they rose higher, to allow more light and air to reach the street. The center shade of the lamp is stair-stepped, like a 1920s skyscraper. The way the sphinxes and pyramids on either side of the lamp are reduced to a series of repeated geometric shapes in a rhythmic pattern shows the influence of Cubism. I think the creator of this lamp was inspired by the Marcel Duchamp painting Nude Descending a Staircase. Egyptomania appeared in a lot of advertising art. but none was so beautifully done as a series of ads running over several years by the Palmolive Company, of which I own these two. The illustration on the left is by one of my favorite 1920s illustrators, Coles Phillips. This ad for Egyptian deities cigarettes appeared in 1919. The wonderful Egyptomania poster for a German restaurant is by Walter Schackenberg. In the years approaching the First World War, women were shedding their restrictive clothing. The need for steel weapons instead of corset stays gave women an excuse to change their fashion. The Egyptian style suited the new natural silhouette perfectly. On the right is a print from my collection called The Dance by V. Monet. One way to date the year of figural Egyptomania is by the styles of makeup, clothing, and in particular the length of a woman's hair. My bust of Cleopatra on the left has long flowing hair, much more like my Art Nouveau sculpture of Odette on the right than that of the flappers of the 1920s. Whether worn up or down, long hair was considered an essential sign of femininity for women in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But when women started to free themselves from the cultural and physical restraints of the Victorian era, they severed their locks as well. The bob hairstyle was invented in 1909 by Polish-born hairstylist Antoni Sierpikowski, known as Antoine of Paris in New York. It was first popularized by dancer Irene Castle in 1915, who was famous for her rebellious spirit, and modeled after Joan of Arc. So this lamp from my collection features a figure with an Egyptian-esque headdress, sporting a castle bob and wearing nothing else but a strand of flapper beads. Notice that her ears are still covered. It would be another 5 years before women found the courage to bare their ears as well as their necks. This unsigned marble from my collection wears a castle bob and harem pants. At least this modest maiden's ears are still covered. As long as the ears were covered, everything else was optional. This bevy of Hollywood beauties shows off the various takes on the bob which existed by 1929. But it was another New York hairdresser named Savelli who claimed to be the first to cut the bob with a razor in a manner called shingling. This allowed him to make the hair lay closer to the neck and to lay flat as well. I don't know if he created this haircut for Anna Mae Wong, but in 1924, a young dancer named Louise Brooks had her hair cut into the sleek black helmet which took the world by storm. Here's another lamp of mine with bobbed hair. Notice how streamlined, regular, and geometric feeling this bob is. You can see the sleek bob on the hair of these two figures in this Vantine's incense burner, as well as this lamp by Fayral, which features a lit glass vessel by Dame Nancy, both from my collection. Dancers were eager to embrace the Egyptian style. Here, dancer Ruth Saint-Denis performs at a party thrown by Tiffany's in 1913. In 1909, the Ballet Russe opened in Paris under the direction of Serge Diaghilev, starring Václav Nijinsky. Chiparis became known for his chryselephantine sculptures of the elaborately costumed dancers of the Ballet Russe, before being inspired by the discovery of the tomb of King Tut to turn to Egyptian themes. The Michael Fokine ballet Cléopâtre was created in 1909 for the Ballet Russe as a vehicle for Ida Rubinstein. When she left to start her own company, and the popular ballet stayed in the repertoire, she was succeeded by Lubov Chernysheva. It wasn't just the professional dancers who were dancing to the new Egyptian tunes. If you could foxtrot, you could walk like an Egyptian. The World's Columbian Exposition was presented in Chicago in 1893, where producer Saul Bloom presented a show called The Algerian Dancers of Morocco, starring a Syrian native, Fared Mazar Siropolis, the wife of a Chicago restaurateur who was dubbed Little Egypt by Bloom. At the time, the Danse du Ventre, or Dance of the Belly, as the French called it, when first seen by Napoleon's troops in Egypt, had never been seen here, and the name belly dance was not in the American vocabulary, so it was called the hoochie coochie, or shimmy and shake. Tradition has it that Bloom himself wrote the melody associated with her dance, which is quoted in many other Egyptomania songs. You know, na 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 na. That one. The earlier Egyptomania songs were heavily romantic. Not surprisingly, beautiful women were featured on Egyptomania covers. This piece is clearly the most beautiful of the Art Nouveau covers, evoking the poster art of Alphonse Mucha. It's a great song, too.
Pyramids of Egypt land, there a Yankee men and dark-eyed maidens, while they talk of moonlight and the night so grand, he would kiss her lips and say, "This is why I stay, for there's Egypt in your dreamy eyes, a bit of Cairo in your style, and the shades of night are in your hair, while fragrant incense seems to fill the air, and the Orient is in your smile, mysterious as river Nile, and you stole my heart with your cunning art, and the Egypt is your dreamy eyes.
The bust of Queen Nefertiti was found at Tel El Amarna by Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt in 1912. But the find did not inspire the makers of Egyptomania, because it was accompanied by neither the fanfare nor the riches of what would be the next great archaeological discovery. Most influential of all historical events in Egyptomania was the discovery of King Tut's tomb by Howard Carter in 1922. It was the last of the great pharaoh's tombs to be found in the Valley of the Kings. Carter's patron, Lord Carnarvon, came close to abandoning the search shortly before it was found. The death of Lord Carnarvon from an infection he received after cutting open a mosquito bite shaving led to the popular notion of the mummy's curse. It took 10 years to remove, preserve, and catalog all the artifacts found in the tomb, during which time Tut mania swept the world. Since there were no foxtrots in the desert, this sheet music cover invites you to come camel trot with King Tut. This costume ball illustration from my collection was styled after King Tut. Although it is sashed at the hips rather than under the bodice, the long lines, loose fabric, and layered garments are still evocative of the earlier revolution in dress design by designer Paul Poiret. Various Egyptian motifs appeared on all kinds of apparel, including this ornately embroidered jacket from France. The swimming girl from the cosmetic spoon appears again as an ornament on this wonderful Egyptomania purse. Tut is not the only pharaoh whose name was used to sell whatever held still long enough. Here's an ad for Ramses perfume, which came out after finding Tut. This French bicycle poster proclaims, "After searching in 1,000 sacred tombs, I finally recovered your favorite Ketima bicycle. Ooh la la!" This iconic cobra lamp by Edgar Brandt is one of the most admired works of Egyptomania decorative arts. This Tiffany clock was inspired by the gateway at Karnak. Erte was born Roman de Tirtov in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1892 and raised among the Russian elite, where he began designing clothing for them when he was only 5 years old. From 1915 to 1936, he designed 240 covers for Harper's Bazaar magazine, while simultaneously working for Vogue magazine. He also created iconic prints and sculptures. While only a few were Egyptian-themed, they were powerful and important designs. He would be called by some the father of the Art Deco movement for his contribution to Deco's sleek, symmetrical, modern style. Even though King Tut was 19 when he died, he remained old King Tut in the popular imagination. Here, in another one of those blends of ancient and modern culture which I enjoy so much, we see two flapper girls waiting on King Tut as an old roue. The one on the right is pouring him a martini. Beneath that hand, you can see his liquor was bottled in 3000 BC. Unfortunately, the radio broadcast by the Nighthawks Band was not preserved, and they never recorded the song in studio. This is an altogether different song, and the one that everybody knows. Here again, a very old King Tut, chomping on a cigar, leers from behind a pyramid at a nubile young woman. It was recorded by Sophie Tucker and the comedy team of Jones and Hare.
3,000 years ago, in history we know, King Tutankhamun ruled a mighty land. He ruled for many years, mid laughter, song, and tears. He made a record that will always stand. Why, they opened up his tomb the other day and jumped with glee. They learned a lot of ancient history. You know, King Tut, 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 on Common Day, beneath the tropic skies, King Tut, Tut, Tut was very wise. Now, old King Tut, Tut, Tut was always gay. Cleopatra, she sat upon his knee. That's where she sat. The girls would dance for him, and every move a treat. They'd move and move and move, but never move their feet. 1,000 girls would dance each day with lots of hip, 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 hooray! You know, King Tut, 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 King Tutty's day.
Chryselephantian sculpture is a technique going back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians. It literally means gold and ivory. During the Art Deco period, however, chryselephantine figures were made with clothing parts cast in patinated or cold-finished bronze, and skin parts carved from ivory. Among the masters of the art were Claire Collinet and Dimitri Chiparos. The museums of Art Deco in Salamanca, Spain, and Moscow both are built around large private collections of these figurines. If you couldn't afford a real chryselephantine figurine, you might have purchased a copy, made from pot metal, patinated to resemble bronze, and cast celluloid plastic body parts, called ivorine. The figure on the left is a spelter and ivorine figure. The figure on the right, also from my collection, is a chryselephantine figure by German artist Ferdinand Preiss, showing a much more modern and barely clothed Art Deco aesthetic. Egyptian motifs were incorporated into several movie palaces built after the discovery of King Tut, including the magnificent Boise Theatre and Paris Egyptian Theatre. Egyptomania Art Deco was a product of the decorative 20s. It fit in perfectly with the other expressions of early Art Deco. It was as colorful as the original Egyptian art, in gold, red, yellow, green, and blue, in stark contrast to the monochromatic palette of the 1930s Deco. It had complex ornamentation covering the surfaces versus the clean surfaces of the Deco to come. Like Art Nouveau, 1920s Art Deco employed natural and opulent materials rather than industrial ones. But unlike either Art Nouveau before it or the Machine Age after it, early Art Deco embraced motifs from ancient and foreign cultures. Egyptomania depicted nature in simplified forms and flat areas of color, much as did Japonism, which also influenced early Art Deco. And lastly, Egyptian art was both symmetrical and geometric, two important hallmarks of the Art Deco style. The Paris exhibition of 1925 was originally planned for 1913 and 1914, but it was stopped by the outbreak of World War I. When it finally opened, it presented works which were made with the same fine materials, traditional craftsmanship, and detailed ornamentation which you would have found in the best decorative arts of previous styles and eras. The architect Le Corbusier, who was also an exhibitor, outraged the exhibition organizers by declaring before they opened their doors that Art Deco was dead. He meant that Marcel Breuer had just designed the first tubular steel chair. So the future of Art Deco, as it headed into the 1930s, would be the monochromatic, streamlined, machine-age materials of the industrial age. Art Deco did change, but that did not happen quite as quickly as Le Corbusier predicted, and Egyptomania continued to flourish. 1929 brought the Chrysler Building in New York City, with its stair-stepped roof and lotus-inspired elevator door panels, blending the sleek design and shiny metal of the machine age with beautiful woods and fine marquetry of the past. The rise in Egyptomania in the late 19th and early 20th century was further propelled by economic and technological growth in the late 19th century and the rise of new technologies, which spread pop culture as powerfully then as the internet has done today. Mass printing made illustrated magazines widely available. The establishment of more publishing houses for music and the lower cost of printing sheet music made it affordable, and the colorful cover art added appeal to the masses. People were buying affordable pianos and learning to play them at home. The influx of Irish and Eastern European immigrants brought musical influences to popular song in America, which led to a renaissance in popular songwriting, the establishment of the writing community known as Tin Pan Alley, and the creation of what is generally called the Great American Songbook. Thomas Edison invented wax cylinder recording in 1877, and the first 78 records were produced in 1887. So by the late 19th century, people were starting to hear recordings of these songs wherever they lived. Commercial radio broadcasts began in the U.S. in 1920. The technology for silent movies was available as early as the 1860s, but silent movies remained a novelty until mass distribution began in the 1890s. The silent movie brought Hollywood stars and stories to the world until talking pictures were introduced in 1929. From about 1890 to the early 20s, there were numerous songs written and published about Egypt and the Orient. I have a large collection of Orientalist and Egyptomania sheet music, most of which I collect for the beautiful covers as much as for the songs themselves. Unless there was a sphinx or pyramid involved, Egypt got lumped into a general fantasy of Orientalism. But they were also reflecting the Western culture of the time. The woman on the right looks less like an Egyptian girl than she does like a vamp, the slang term for the sexually liberated and predatory modern woman, derived from the word vampire. The word is thought to come from the 1915 Hollywood movie called A Fool There Was, in which there was a female character called the Vampire. Here she looks ready to take a bite out of somebody. When it came to comedy, it was considered more important to be alliterative than authentic.
You'd better go and get your dresses. Everyone's got the opera glasses. Oh, such a sad disgrace. No one looks in your face. Ladies alone go home. They say that Lena is the queen of Palestina, just because she plays a concertina. She only knows one song. She plays it all day long. Sometimes she plays it wrong, but how they love it, want more of it. I heard her play once or twice. Oh, murder, still it was nice. All the girls, they're dressed like Lena. Some wear oatmeal, some farina. Down old Palestina way.
Sheet music artists were not concerned with historical accuracy or the differences between national costume within the Middle East. That thing on the head of the girl on the right is somewhere between a curtain and a lampshade, but it's certainly not anything like an actual Egyptian headdress. In this illustration of an Egyptian lady, the lady on the left has a plumed vulture headdress like the one worn by Cleopatra. The vulture represented the goddess Nekhbet, representing Upper Egypt and its protection. It was often worn by the great royal wife and by female pharaohs. But the woman on the right is wearing the uraeus, or snake symbol, representing the serpent goddess Wadjet. The uraeus represents Lower Egypt and was worn by the pharaoh as an ornament in the front of the headdress or encircling the head, indicating the pharaoh's divine authority and power. Cleopatra wears both symbols, indicating her sovereignty over all of Egypt. You can see King Tut wearing both the vulture and snake symbols as well. Again, what's most fun for me about Egyptomania is when I see one culture playing with the other. So I love these covers from my collection because I'm clearly looking at flappers just having fun and doing the Egyptian thing. The covers of these songs about mummies were a lot better than the songs themselves, including the geographically confused My Egyptian Mummy, which calls her his Turkish delight. I bet Howard Carter would have liked to find what Mr. Aronson imagined to be hiding inside this sarcophagus. 1,000,000 years may be stretching it a bit, but it was worth the wait for the Mummy Mine song.
Oh, take me where my love lies dreaming, and the Nile is gleaming. stars make me turn the desert gloomy into garden gloomy, where no prison bars hold you. A million years you have been sleeping so restlessly. A million years I lived in weaving so endlessly. I've waited through the years just crying. Oh, can't you hear me again crying? Waken, your love no more denying
The theater contributed to the continued public obsession with Cleopatra. Cleopatra's reputation in the popular imagination was amplified by Sardou's play Cleopatra in 1891, performed in France by Sarah Bernhardt and in America starring Fanny Davenport, as well as by George Bernard Shaw's play Caesar and Cleopatra in 1906. Cleomania raged on into the 20th century as she became increasingly a part of the pop culture zeitgeist.
She's as cold as Theda Bear, Theda's bear, but Becky's bearer since Rebecca came back home.
The African American community contributed to Egyptomania through performance art. This early Egyptomania song was performed on stage by Burt Williams and George Walker in Dahomey, the first musical on Broadway to be written and performed entirely by African Americans.
It ain't no use for you try to rise up in the social scale, lest you can trace your name back to the flood. You've got to have an ancestral hold and you mustn't fail to prove that indigo's mixed in your blood. I just found out that I came down Mochi Bungaboo. My great-grandfather was his great-grandchild. Now I am going to sail away across the ocean blue, occupy my castle on the Nile. In my castle on that river Nile, I'm going to live in elegant style. Inlaid diamond on the floor, the bamboo butler at my door, with that Princess Kalamazoo. Plus we're gonna change from red to blue, entertain royalty all the while in the castle on the river Nile.
Ragtime music came out of the African American community in the 1890s and continued in popularity through the teens. It combined the regularity of march music with irregular accents and polyrhythms. The three best-known composers of ragtime were African American Scott Joplin and James Scott, as well as the only non-African American among them, Irish American Joseph F. Lamb, who gave us the lovely Cleopatra Rag in 1915. The African American traditions of blues and ragtime continued to evolve into jazz music, which soon became known as jazz music. It was characterized by swing and blue notes, complex chords, polyrhythms, and improvisation. One of the first so-called jazz tunes ever recorded was the Egyptomania song Cleopatra Had a Jazz Band.
History repeats itself, so the wise men say. I believe they're right because last night I heard peculiar music play. In dreams it seems it took me back 2,000 years ago, which only goes to prove that Egyptians were not slow. Cleopatra had a jazz band in her castle on the Nile. Every night she gave a jazz dance in a queer Egyptian style. She won Mark Anthony with a syncopated harmony, and as they played, she swayed. She knew she had him all the while in the shadow of the pyramid, neath the old Egyptian moon. A sphinx was looking on and said there'll be a wedding soon. But the real historic scandal was that Cleo lost her sandal as she danced to the strains of that Egyptian jazz band tune.
But it was Theda Bera's lost silent film of Cleopatra in 1917 that really cemented Cleopatra's image as a dangerous vamp. To the patriarchal and conservative Victorians, sexually liberated and empowered women were a dangerous threat. This piece of Italian sheet music, inspired by Theda's Cleopatra, is seen here next to an article about how to recognize a dangerous vamp. Their daughters would soon rebel against their mother's temperance movement and Victorian morality, to evolve into the cigarette-smoking, bobbed hair, corset-less, prohibition-defying, promiscuous, sexually ambiguous, cocaine-fueled, Charleston-dancing flappers of the 1920s. Gotta love them. The musical Leave It to Jane had a book by Guy Bolton and P.G. Woodhouse, with music by Jerome Kern. It was set on a college campus where Jane tells the audience what she has been studying.
In days of old, beside the Nile, a famous queen there dwelt. Her clothes were few but full of style, her figure slim and svelte. On every man that wandered by, she pulled the Theda Bara eye. And everyone observed with awe that her work was swift but never raw. Like Cleopatra, if I could have my way. Each man she met, she wed and kissed, and she dozens on her waiting list. I wish that I had lived there beside the pyramid, for a girl today don't get the scope that Cleopatra did. She danced new dances now and then, the sort that make you blush. Each time she did them, scores of men got injured in the rush. They'd stand there gaping in a line and watch her agitate her spine. It simply used to knock them flat when she went like this and then like that. Dancing Cleopatra was always on the spot. She gave those poor Egyptian ginks something else to watch beside the Sphinx. Mark Antony admitted that what first made him skid was the wibbly wobbly wibbly dance that Cleopatra did.
The influx of immigrants to America led to the creation of recordings emulating different national and ethnic accents and styles. What we would call an appropriation of culture today was seen more as a celebration of our diversity back then.
You've heard of Cleopatra, who lived down beside the Nile. She made a mark of Antony and won him with her smile. They say she was Egyptian, but I've reason to construe she was Jewish and Hawaiian with a dash of Irish too. When she floated bold Mark Antony on Egypt's yellow sand, you could see that she was Jewish by the motion of her hands. He would take her hands and shoulders off. That's the way she made her muscles up. I think she was Hawaiian from Honolulu too. She would dance like this to the Yakahula Hickey Doo, Yakahula Hickey Doo. Her mother's name was Cleo, her father's name was Pat, so they called her Cleopatra. Now what do you think of that?
It must have been the Irish who built the pyramids, for no one else could carry up the bricks. It must have been a Dial who dug the river Nile, for no one but an Irishman would fight a crocodile. I think those mixed word Turks, Mohammedans and Gurks, they speak of Irish Turkey to this day. Cleopatra was a Colleen who came from Connemara. She lost her nationality while roaming round Sahara. So all the hooligans and all the dooligans must have been Egyptians long ago.
Anticipation of prohibition contributed one of Egyptomania's very best novelty songs, Sahara Will Soon Be Dry Like You, sung by Esther Walker.
King Ramesses went to pieces 7,000 years ago, and passed a law that Egypt must go dry. He took the liquors from the shickers all the way to Jericho, but kept a little toddy on the slide. The desert of Sahara flowed with honey, so they say, till through a vision came along and dried it up one day. Sahara, we sympathize with you, Sahara. Now we're dry like you. I know why Cleopatra put that snake against her skin. She lost her mind completely when she lost her garden sin. Over Khayyam took a leap into his caravan. He took his wine glass and away he flew. And ever since all those Egyptians moved their funny arms so queer, they got that way from reaching for imaginary signs of a fear. Sahara, Sahara, now we're dry like you. I've got the old Sahara prohibition blues.
I also have a large collection of movie magazines from the teens and 20s, which I collect for the wonderful illustrated covers. On the left is Rudolph Valentino in his star-making turn as the Sheik. 5 years later, he played both father and son in Son of the Sheik. Here he is again, featured on this 1920s candy box in my collection. I also own the wonderful Royal Ducks figurine on the left, modeled after Valentino and co-star Vilma Banky in Son of the Sheik.
I'm looking for the Sheik of Araby, that double-crossing Sheik of Araby. He stole my gal away last Monday week today, and he vamped her with a banjo on his knee. And he vamped her with a banjo on his knee. Banjo. Oh, so sorry. I ride the lonely desert night and day, and all my camel says is nay, nay, nay. For that camel doesn't know how far he's got to go before we catch the Sheik of Araby.
Ziegfeld star and comedienne Fanny Brice lampooned the Sheik the following year with The Sheik of Avenue B.
On the tide of New York, I never
nothing talk, no a wise guy is he. He has such a reputation for making goilies fall. Fat one, small one, thin one, tall one, he gets them all. He's the sheep of Avenue B. I'm telling you, he's the champ of them all. He's no bluff. He treats the girls rough. His hugs and kisses scare 'em. He don't spare 'em. You should see his Hebrew harem. He wants them all to tell him when he goes by. Rose Goldstein's husband, tell him them in the eye. Say he acts like a real Arabian lord. Since he brought a brand new second-hand Ford, don't speak. He's the chic of Avenue B.
Romance was filling the hot desert air and American bedrooms. The 1926 operetta The Desert Song spawned film versions in 1929, as well as 3 later ones. The 1929 film was a bold technological advance, appearing in the same year as the very first talking picture, The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson.
Are you the red shadow?
À votre service, mademoiselle.
You dare come here?
I heard you call for romance. I do long for romance. I would dare anything to get what I want. But what would you dare? That's what I came to find out.
Do you realize that one scream from me would wipe out the red shadow?
But you wouldn't call for romance in one breath and send it away in the next. Will you come with me? If you come, I promise not to hold you. But you will stay.
You're very sure of yourself.
I'm sure of the desert magic. My desert is waiting. Dear, come here with me. I'm longing to teach you love's sweet melody. I'll sing a dream song to you. Painting a picture for two.
Women got to turn the tables on their philandering men with this song.
Just remember if you single, your mama's gonna cheap on you. What's all for the blue, it's all for the gander. That's the saying too. Listen, brother, ain't no ifs and ands and buts. Understand me, honey, when I strut, I strut. Just remember if you tickle your mama's gonna cheap on you.
If you ask me what is the greatest Egyptomania song of the era, I think it has to be Egyptionella. I'm waiting for Lizzo to cover it.
Ella was a dancing gal who started getting fat. Well, every day brought 2 more pounds to Ella. Until one day she found she'd lost her job because of that. And then to make it worse, she lost her fella. So she took a trip to Egypt to forget. But she made such a hit that she's there yet. Well, if you hear of a gal who can shake and quake till it makes you think of a nervous snake, they're speaking of Egyptionella. Why, she weighs 220, but they don't care. They like 'em plenty that way out there. She has the love of every fella. Well, she does a dance with certain parts by the River Nile that make all the boys take their old sweethearts and throw them to the crocodiles. And every sheik in the audience jumps up and offers her love intense. Oh, how they love Egyptionella.
Of course, every generation puts its spin on Cleopatra, including Claudette Colbert's slinky version of her, which reflected streamlined Deco as well as Egyptomania. In more recent times, we all still recall Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra. In the 1964 movie Roustabout, Elvis Presley invoked the memory of Little Egypt. Egyptomania got its last great shot in the arm when the artifacts from King Tut's tomb toured the world in 1976 and 77. Supposedly making fun of the commercialization of King Tut, Saturday Night Live, starring young Steve Martin, does the very same thing.
Now if I'd known they'd line up just to see you, I'd taken all my money and bought me a museum. King Tut.
The Bangles taught us to walk like an Egyptian
in 1986.
And in 1992, country artist Pam Tillis crowned herself
Cleopatra. Everybody calls, I'm the queen of denial.
Sadly, there is no permanent public collection of Egyptomania. The last museum exhibit was in 1979 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Regrettably, they did not produce a catalog, and they don't have any record of what was displayed. So it remains the responsibility and the privilege of collectors to be the curators of Egyptomania for future generations. So we leave this survey of Egyptomania with this image of the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. Its shining beacon reminds us that we are still fascinated by the mystery, beauty, sensuality, and grandeur of ancient Egypt. Thanks again to Icads and the Chicago Art Deco Society for allowing me to be part of this worldwide celebration of Art Deco Day.
Okay, so we're back, and thank you, Jeff, for such an entertaining presentation. I see Rolf already clapping, and you're getting thanks in the chat as well. Yeah, let me just see if your mic is working. Just say something.
3,000 years in 1 hour. Not easy to do.
That's definitely true, and you've done such a great and entertaining job. We have some questions coming in, and I just want to reiterate that you can write your questions for Jeff in the chat on Zoom feature, and I'll be reading them. So, Jeff, if you're ready, I think we can start with the first question and see where it takes us.
I will say this to all of you, that My interest in Egyptomania is coming from having been a performer. As you can see, the focus of my presentation was on the musical and performance history of Egyptomania. I am not an architectural historian. I'm not even a deep Egyptologist. I've sort of exhausted my knowledge of Egyptian myth and religion and what I told you. So I'm more interested in your experience about it. I can't tell you. I see a question here about, was there a survey of Masonic temples? I have no idea. But let's see what else we're asking here.
Well, there are no other questions. There is a Rolf mentioned, but I guess we can use that for later. The Egyptian theater in DeKalb, Illinois was built in 1928 to 1930 with exterior terracotta by Northwest Terracotta of Chicago, and a fully decorated interior. Is the only one of the 7 surviving Egyptian-themed theaters east of the Rocky Mountains. So if you have a question for Jeff that's not historically related, maybe...
I will say about the theaters, you know, there I had to leave out, trying to get everything in within an hour. I had to leave out a little bit of everything I want to talk about. For instance, the Egyptian theater in Los Angeles, most people think of that as inspired by Tutmania. The reason the Egyptian theater ended up the Egyptian theater was they decided it was cheaper to do that than Spanish revival, not because they were very passionate about ancient Egypt. The DeKalb theater, I probably should have included. We'll see if I can get that in the revised version here. And I see this comment in the text about Egyptomania being collected by the V&A, the V&A Museum and the Berlin Egyptian Museum. I hope somebody, though, does an Egyptomania exhibition again soon. That's they've got it, but it's stored away, like King Tut's tomb. I'm curious to know if anybody out there is a collector of Egyptomania at all, if you have any other artifacts or photos or stories to contribute to my presentation.
Okay, so the way we can do that is you can raise your hand if you like to share something about your personal Egyptomania. So I see Joe Marlin already asked here. I'm gonna let you unmute, so just gonna hit yes, Joe.
Yes, I have a tray that I believe a serving dish that I believe that was either a wedding or a engagement present to my mother in the mid-1920s. That's maybe 1.5 feet by 2 feet inlaid with glass, but on the edge, around the edge in gold, are pseudo hieroglyphics. So I'm sure it was kind of a Egyptian revival from that period. I still have it in my front hallway. I keep my spare change and stuff in it before I go out the door.
There was also a piece of Egyptian Wedgwood that I didn't get a picture in. I may try and put it in the future. Wedgwood also was very interested in Egyptomania at the turn of the 19th century.
Rolf, go ahead. Just hit the yes button. There you go.
Yes. Regarding the belly dancers, they were very popular already in England in the 1870s because Thomas Cook, who invented mass tourism in the 1840s, took 300 or 400 people down the Nile on every tour, which he did twice a year, and featured belly dancers. So the broad British public already was quite well aware of Egyptomania at the tourist level. And then it comes to Chicago in 1893 at the World's Fair, and everybody goes crazy for little Egypt and stuff, and it becomes an American thing to talk about.
That's very interesting because I haven't seen any posts online about Thomas Cook and what he's done. I'm going to go, you'll have to send me any reference you've got about that so I can look at that.
There's a couple of history books on the history of Thomas Cook and company, and they talk extensively about the Nile tours. There's nothing online, but he had his own charter boats that went down the Nile, featuring belly dancers, which were probably Cairo prostitutes or Alexandrian women, because the average Islamic woman, Muslim, didn't do that kind of thing, at least not in public.
I have a friend I wasn't able to consult with before doing this who knows a lot more than I do about the national costumes in the Middle East, and that the conflating of costume in all of those illustrations was also very historically fuzzy.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to get a survey of who actually wore what where. I'm sure very few of them ran around as naked as we like to depict them in our early Art Deco illustrations.
Well, that's all part of Egyptomania that developed in the Orientalism style of painting, when they had harem-scarum scenes and all that. Women smoking cigarettes. No Westerner ever saw any of that.
Right.
It's really a great topic. I love it.
Another 2 hours worth.
Yeah. Well, there's also Camel cigarettes that you could show a little pack because they were popular in the 20s.
Egyptian deities, which I showed that one ad, the illustration on the poster from the Met exhibit is actually an for Egyptian deities cigarettes. I didn't mention that.
Yeah.
Presentation.
I will allow everyone to unmute if you have something you'd like to share. So if you have something you'd like to share with us, just hit the unmute button. You can do that now and go ahead.
I'm wondering how many people had never heard those songs before. You know, some of those recordings are on the internet, some I had to find. I had to do a lot of audio enhancement to make them listenable because there was a lot of crackling, etc., in them. But most people, I think, have never seen the sheet music covers, and many have never heard a lot of those songs.
I'm one of them. I was fascinated by the sheet music covers. There's quite a collection at the Newberry here in Chicago, but I don't know how much Egyptomania there is in their collection.
The sheet music covers are sort of scarce as hen's teeth, and it has been fun as a collector. Half the fun is the hunt. In fact, that's 90% of the fun. You know, there's stuff I've spent 20 years trying to find. And like the Moonlight on the Nile sheet music cover, I was looking for that for years and years. And one day I was at a flea market, and I was standing at a pile of sheet music, as I often do, about to go through it for the next half an hour, saying to myself, this is ridiculous. I could search for another 20 years. I will never find this piece of sheet music. As soon as I said that to myself, I moved aside the first piece of sheet music. It was the second piece of sheet music in the pile. It was in mint condition, and I got it for $1. Thank you, God. That's all I can say. That's what we live for as collectors, moments like that.
I think Catherine would like to share something with us. Go ahead, Catherine.
I just wanted to thank you very much for showing the desert song. I really have always loved that, and the extract was very, very nice and made me feel very good and happy, as well as your talk, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you know, I was a musical theater person. I love the modern musical theater. The musical theater evolved greatly in the 20th century. And it's interesting, Hollywood would take stuff that wasn't really well done in a modern sense as they move forward in film versions and revise it just enough, keeping the flavor of the original, but making it more contemporary and more filmic. I might revise this presentation and show a clip, a little bit of the Gordon MacRae 1953 version, which I love. It's how I fell in love with Gordon MacRae, which is a lot less hammy. John Bowles was a terrible actor. And off the top of my head, I forget that woman's name, but she must be the worst musical theater performer I've ever seen. She can't sing. She looks terrible. She's a miserable actress. And yet it was a big hit. Yes, Rolf, you say something else?
Well, I was going to mention a comment on I love the Egyptians were Irish song, which has a history to it, not the song that they didn't know this, but in the early Christian period in Ireland, there were quite a number of Egyptian Coptic Christians that went to Ireland as monks. And there are tombstones in Ireland with Coptic scenes on them from the 5th and 6th century of the Common Era. It's a little known archaeological bit of research, but there were Egyptians in Ireland long before that great song was written.
Yeah, there were a bunch of, the Irish thing was, they loved that. There's also a song called Cleopatra Finnegan. I didn't put it up there because the cover's not really great. And there's Fatima Brown, the woman who performed as Little Egypt she performed first under the name of Fatima. So that may be what inspired that song.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So nobody out there has got any other pieces of Egyptomania in their collection. It's really interesting how narrow interest it is and how little of it I guess there really is in people's homes.
Well, I'm just going to share Jeff's email with everybody. I believe Jeff would just would like you to share anything or just write to him. So in the chat, I'm just going to paste Jeff's email. Is that what you would like, Jeff?
Yes, please. And thank you, Tim, for telling me about Meredith Axelrod and Craig, because I want to do a presentation while I can still sing and dance a little myself. I want to call this Tut Tunes and Mummy Music and do a live presentation of some of the songs that you heard here. So I'm interested in looking up what Meredith Axelrod and Craig Ventresco have been doing with that. The San Francisco people are great. Anybody who's ever been to the San Francisco group, they're very into dress and performance and recreationism. They do the Gatsby weekend, and I try to encourage our group in Chicago to do more active things, because while a lot of Egyptomania may be associated with architecture and tombs of dead people, the fun of Egyptomania for me, as you could see, was in its living recreation and presentation.
Well, thank you all for being here, and I think with given a day or two of time, we'll have the recording processed and send out a link to everyone so that you can review it again, or for those of you who are in middle of the night time zones, you'll have a chance to watch the recording. Thanks so much to Jeff for all the work he did pulling this together, and thank you to Zarko who's on the other side of the world, for staying up so late to manage this. Thank you to everyone.